We're back, everybody. I wanted to produce a quick video to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the 5 principles of the Enlightenment. These are the 5 ways we know that an argument is rational or an argument is irrational. A rational argument has several, if not all 5 of these Enlightenment characteristics. Irrational arguments do not. So these are principles that are important for us to explain as simply and clearly as we can now for understanding, but also because in your first big assignment in this course, the Enlightenment paper, you'll be employing one or more, not all 5, but one or more of these characteristics. So we need to make sure that we all understand these things. So in sum, the very first principle of rational Enlightenment thought is transparency. An arguer doesn't camouflage a weak argument behind secrecy. The arguer lets the audience democratically assess the strengths and weaknesses of all of the evidence that they think support a particular conclusion. So lots of commercials that you'll hear, whether it's on Spotify, where I hear most of my commercials, or on YouTube or whatever, are guilty of a lack of transparency. For instance, common on my Spotify playlist now is Snoop Dogg hawking some sort of men's hair protection, hair care product and saying that science proves that this particular product is going to keep hair on men's heads, right? So there's a baldness cure that, quote unquote, science has predicted. It's not exactly the most transparent way to sell a product by saying, quote, science proves it. A second way in which we know an argument is rational as opposed to irrational is if it has a clear method. If there is a step-by-step reproducible process by which a person or a team or an organization has come to a particular conclusion. The most obvious example is the scientific method that Bill Nye discussed in the video, and there was a chart on the Prezi as well that simplified some of the stuff that we all learned in junior high school, middle school, and high school. But you could even, it doesn't have to be as specific and step-by-step as long as there is a reproducible process. For instance, if I said, I just happened to listen to 2 random Beyonce albums and I thought they were the best Beyonce albums that she's ever done, versus if I methodically went through and said, well, here is the way that I was measuring greatness in Beyonce albums, and I went through every single one of her albums, and I have come to the conclusion that this one and Lemonade are the best ones, right? The latter example is the more methodical example because I wasn't just choosing albums at random or choosing ones that happened to cross my desk or cross my feed. Instead, I went through every single one of them to make a more methodical judgment. A third way in which we know an argument is the result of a rational process is if it is objective. It has the arguer or the organization, whoever's putting forth this particular argument, done anything to reduce their own biases. And biases are obviously can be financial, right? One of the very famous quotations in American history is the famous muckraker who wrote The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, that it's very difficult to get somebody to understand something if their salary depends on them not understanding it. And this is when he was attacking filth and corruption in the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the teens and 1920s. But it doesn't necessarily have to be just financial types of bias. It can be any kind of family-related or ideological or kin-based motivated reasoning. But in a general sense, that kind of bias and motivated reasoning that can affect us all is something that Enlightenment thinkers recognized and said that we had to go through particular measures to try to check our own biases. And the final method, one of the ways that we know in which an argument is rational, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, it just means it's a part of a rational process. If it's not just an individual's conclusion, but if it's set against a competitive environment. More heads are better than one. More people have looked at this question, have exhaustively searched for the facts or the truth in a particular circumstance, and so the conclusion is not just the result of one person's point of view, but in fact it has been tested and competed in a way in the free marketplace of ideas against other people's ideas in the way that other people have gone through the same process. A very famous example in this instance can be the Washington Post published in 1980 a story called Jimmy's World. And Jimmy's World was famously a story about an 8-year-old boy who was using heroin, and it was meant to be a real spotlight on drug addiction in the city. It turns out the journalist who wrote Jimmy's World, who actually won a Pulitzer Prize, had invented the entire story, whole cloth. And so the Washington Post looked like it was producing, quite literally, fake news because the news had been faked about this guy Jimmy, this kid Jimmy, who didn't exist. But the Washington Post, what it did was it went back through and had a set of team members, of journalists, go back through and each try to identify what had gone wrong. And then they competed, in a sense, over who had the best indictment of the ways in which the Washington Post editorial system and journalistic system let something like this get on the front page and then win the Pulitzer Prize. And so even though they were guilty in this one instance of producing propaganda or news that was faked for a particular purpose, they didn't cover it up, right? They went competitively and exhaustively back through their errors and came up with a more rational result.